My name is Gene C. Richards. I'm a Korean War veteran. I was born September the 13th, 1929.
29.
Yes, sir.
And where?
In Nolan County, Texas, way out a couple of hundred miles west of here.
Uh-huh. And what school did you go?
What school?
Yeah.
I went to a small, very small school by the name of Hermleigh, Hermleigh.
Mm-hmm.
Hermleigh, Texas. It's in Scurry County.
Mm-hmm.
I was born in Nolan County, but spent most of my young life in Scurry County. There were 10 siblings. I'm number 5 of 10.
Wow, 10 of them.
Well, there were 2 of us got here. I'm a twin. So,
Twin?
yes, my twin was number 4, so I'm number 5.
Uh-huh.
So he's about 10 minutes older than me. Yes, sir. And then there were 5 more after us. Of the 10, 6 of us served in the armed forces
Wow.
of the United States. My dad was born in 1899. He was a World War I veteran.
Wow.
And he served in France. He was wounded in France by a German machine gunner, so he got a Purple Heart. He came home from the war, and within a couple of years, 3 years, he met our mother, and they were married in 1922. So,
It was a military family.
yes, our dad was, Army, and 6 of the 10 served in the armed service. My twin brother was enlisted in the Air Force, but he first in 1948 enlisted in the Marine Corps.
Mm.
So he served a short time in the Marine Corps, and he was medically discharged because he had an injury that forced him out. So 2 years later, he enlisted in the Air Force in June of 1950, and 2 weeks after he enlisted, the Korean War broke out.
When did you graduate high school?
I graduated from high school in 1947.
And did you know anything about Korea?
No, sir, hadn't even heard of it. And even 4 years later, when they drafted me into the Army,
Uh-huh.
of course, then I knew where it was, because the Army was, as soon as, South Korea was invaded and the war broke out and the United Nations joined in,
Right.
of course, then it was on the news, and so we learned where Korea was located. But up to this point in time, we knew nothing about Korea.
Huh.
Yes.
So what were you doing after the graduation of high school?
Well, at that time, of course, hardly any families could afford to send their children to college. There was no money available, and college just wasn't even a consideration for most people. A lot of people I served with in the Army had some college. Even a few of my OCS classmates had college degrees.
Mm-hmm.
But in our family, no one had ever gone to college.
Mm-hmm.
And so we lived in the oil fields of West Texas, where there was a lot of work. So when I got out of high school, I got a job in 1948
Mm-hmm.
with a seismograph crew, which is oil field exploration.
Oil?
Oil field exploration.
Mm-hmm.
Seismograph crews, they use seismographs and create miniature explosions, make recordings, make measurements of the strata below the surface, and so they are used for oil field exploration to try to figure out where oil deposits are beneath the earth.
Mm.
So I worked basically with a surveying crew for 2 years, and then in the late 50, I received my draft notice from Uncle Sam.
Mm.
And I was 21 years old. That was the guidelines pretty much then. Once you had to register for your draft when you become 18.
Yeah.
So on your 18th birthday, you had to register for the draft.
Mm-hmm.
They were already drafting people. They weren't drafting people then because the Korean War hadn't broken out. Draft was still in existence, which started in 1940,
Mm-hmm.
in the early part of World War II. But when World War II ended, they pretty much stopped drafting people because they were downsizing. they had so many million people in the service.
Yeah. When you were drafted, what was your reaction? You knew that you're going to be dragged into the Korean War, right?
Yes, well, I knew I was going to be drafted. There was no doubt about it. So some people that, buddies and friends, people I knew, knowing they would be drafted, went ahead and enlisted so they wouldn't have to be in a foxhole maybe.
Mm-hmm.
So they enlisted in the Navy. They wouldn't enlist in, very many enlisted in the Marine Corps because they're just another infantry unit.
Mm-hmm.
But they enlisted in the Navy or the Air Force.
Yeah.
And my twin brother enlisted in the Air Force in early June of '50. But I just waited until I was drafted, which was, I'd received.
Why? You're twin brother. You are twin, and I thought that you would think same way, and do the.
Yes, sir. The thing of it is, my twin and I are not identical twins.
I see.
And the fact is, we're really different. He's 6 feet tall, blonde-headed and blue-eyed. I was 5'8", brown-haired and brown-eyed. But I got my genes from my mother's side of the family, and he from our dad's side of the family, the Richards.
Huh.
And we, during the service and all our lives since the service, we've just gone different paths, but we're close. We got together in Korea, actually, for Christmas of 1952, and it was a fluke thing that happened. Neither one of us thought that was possible to happen. I've written a story about it, and I'll send that story to you. But I call
we'll talk about that later.
Yes, okay.
So when you were drafted, and where did you go to receive basic military training?
Okay, I had to report to my local draft board in Sweetwater, Texas, and they sent me to Camp Chaffee, Arkansas, and that's where I took infantry basic training, which is the first 6 weeks of your basic. Once we finished that, the entire training company, which was 204 recruits, were put on a troop train and moved to Fort Sill, Oklahoma. And none of us knew this because the Army didn't tell you anything in those days. We found out we were all screened during the induction process for fire direction school in the field artillery because of our IQs and our just the things that we would probably be good at. So we were selected during the screening process of induction for this fire direction school in Fort Sill, field artillery. So when we finished the basic training in Camp Chaffee, they transported us to Fort Sill, Oklahoma, where we took advanced basic for the next 8 weeks. And during the middle or latter part of the phase of that, some of us learned that we were eligible for officer candidate school. We had scored high enough on the OCT test that was given during the induction process. So several of us decided, why not? So we went ahead and applied for OCS, and actually it was about, I think, seven out of that basic training group were accepted to the OCS. But before we could get into OCS, we had to go to a leadership school, an Army leadership school. It was a prerequisite for OCS. So we had to wait a while for that after we finished the advanced basic. But eventually, 3 of us were sent back to Camp Chaffee for the leadership school. Others went to leadership schools at different forts and camps. So the leadership course was about a couple, 3 months in the summer of 1951 at Camp Chaffee. When we finished that, then a few weeks later, we received our acceptance into the Field Artillery OCS back at Fort Sill. So I reported there, and our class, which was class number 11, actually started on October the 17th, 1951. The Korean War had been going for a little over a year. So it was by this time OCS was a 6-month course. In World War II, it was a 90-day course. And that's where they got the term, they're the 90-day wonders. And one of a Fort Benning OCS graduate who I met many years later is a friend of mine now, wrote a book called The 90-Day Wonders. And it's the history of all the Army OCS. A great book.
What is OCS again, please?
Officer Candidate School.
OCS. Okay.
OCS, Officer Candidate School. The Army had about 10 or 12 of them during World War II and again and during the Korean War. The two big ones, of course, were infantry and artillery.
Okay. So you were aware of the Korean War already,
Yes, sir.
and what were you thinking? You thought that to yourself you might be dragged into the Korean War, right?
Yes, I was pretty sure I would be. And then once I got into OCS, I was almost certain I would, because there was an extreme shortage of junior officers in Korea, and especially infantry and artillery, because that's where so many of them were being killed in action, and they needed infantry and field artillery, you know, young second lieutenants and first lieutenants and captains. Those are the junior grade of officers.
So when did you graduate this OCS?
I graduated from OCS 6 months later.
Which is
Yes,
19...
April the 8th, 1952.
April 8th, 1952?
Yes, sir.
And then what happened?
Well, then, upon graduation, the Army, in its infinite wisdom, knew that we needed some training with troops, you know, to get our feet on the ground and learn. And so the whole class, there were 74 graduates. We were sent to 17 different Army forts and camps all over the United States for duty with just different units, just to give us about 4 or 5 months of duty, you know, working with the troops. And most of us realized that probably within a short time of being sent to these different camps, we would be going to Korea. And sure enough, in about August of 1952, I was sent to Camp Polk, Louisiana.
And you were second lieutenant.
I was a brand new second lieutenant, yeah.
Brand new.
Yeah, my wife pinned my gold bars on my shoulder. On my new tailor-made uniforms.
You were married at the time?
Yes, sir.
Ah.
When I received my draft notice when I was working in the oil fields of West Texas, I called my fiance and said, "I've got my draft notice. I'm coming home this weekend. We're getting married."
You older her.
Yeah.
And she got it.
Well, we'd been wanting to get married since for a year, but the only reason we didn't was because we didn't have any money.
No.
You know, we were very poor.
How much were you paid when you were a brand new lieutenant?
A brand new lieutenant, I think it was about $100 and maybe $190 a month, so maybe $180 a month, somewhere in that. That might not be correct, but I can give you the correct figure by email when I get home.
Yes.
Because I have the old officer's manual that was issued to us upon graduation that had all the information about how we were etiquette and everything, you know.
So you had a honeymoon. Where?
At home where we got married. 3 days. 4 days after we were married, we were married on January the 8th, 1951. I reported for induction on January the 12th, and I didn't get to see her again for a couple of months. Yeah, but until I got to Fort Sill, you know, for the advanced field artillery training, basic training. And then first weekend I was up there, she drove up from Eastland, Texas to Fort Sill. But back in those days it was probably a 5-hour drive. Now it's if you had a wife when you went into the Army, then they set up, I forget what they called it, an allowance. So you got an extra allowance for being married.
I see.
Yes, sir.
So that's another incentive. Huh?
Yeah. Well, once I became an officer, I said when I got orders to go overseas, I signed papers to take a huge portion of my second lieutenant's salary and just be sent to her, because I knew I wouldn't need much spending money in Korea, if any, you know.
So when did you know that you were going to go to Korea?
Not until I got orders at Camp Polk in August of 1952.
Oh.
And so I had probably 3 weeks leave and travel time before I had to report to Camp Stoneman, California, which is where you ship from to get to the Far East.
Mm.
And so basically your orders don't say you're going to Korea, but you know you are.
Yeah.
That you're going to the Far East, which is Camp Drake, Japan, which is where General MacArthur was nearby. He was over the entire Far East.
So when did you leave for Korea?
Okay, I left in probably in early October. Okay. I have pretty much the exact date down on a story I've written. I'll send you. But it was early October, because I arrived in Camp Drake, Japan. Incidentally, they put us all. There was several of my class there at Camp Stoneman, all reporting in from different forts and camps, all on orders for the Far East. So we had to report to Camp Stoneman, California, and they put us all on chartered DC airliners, Northwest Airlines, or Pan American Airlines, I went. So they flew us, it took 3 legs of flight to get to Tokyo. So we went from Travis Air Force Base to Honolulu, Hawaii, Hickam Field, on to Wake Island, and then from Wake Island into Tokyo. So it was 10 hours, 11 hours, and 12 hours.
So
33 hours.
you stopped in Honolulu?
Yes, we had to stop and refuel.
Refuel.
I can say I'd been in Hawaii, but I didn't get to see anything but Hickam Field.
All right. So what did you do in Japan? How long?
Okay, 4 days. I was just processing through the big Army replacement depot, Camp Drake, which was, I guess, for all the bases in the Far East, Okinawa and other places, mainly Korea. So within 4 days, I had orders to ship to the Army replacement depot in Incheon.
Incheon. So
Yes, it's actually Yeongdong-po is where it was actually located.
I know, but you arrived in Incheon, right?
Yes.
Do you remember?
They put us on a troop ship in Yokohama, and then for just a day and a half, we sailed around the southern tip of Japan, and we docked at Busan.
Oh, you arrived in Busan.
Yeah, arrived in Busan October the 18th, 1952.
So what was your first kind of impression when you saw Korea for the first time? How was Busan area?
Well, it was it was just desolate, a lot of war damage. We were all scared, I'll tell you, because we didn't know what was next. We knew that we were going to go, up a ways north of there, up to the 38th parallel, because by this time, the war had become what we call a static war. The front lines had settled down along the 38th parallel where it is now, 60 years later. So we were there only a couple of hours or 3 at the most, unloading from the ship, and they put us on a South Korean train that went from there up to Seoul, and then we got off there and reported into the 8th Army Replacement Depot at Yeongdong-po. And then from there, there were not only members from my OCS class, but just junior officers and just enlisted men by the thousand just going through there, being assigned to all the different divisions along the front. And at that time, there were, I think, 8 divisions in Korea, one of them being the 1st Marine Division. There were 7 Army divisions, and they were all deployed along the front.
What was your division?
I was in the 7th.
7th Division?
Yes, it's the Hourglass Division. It's this, I have this bolo tie I have on is the logo, the 7th Division. I even have a 7th Division watch on.
Ah. Let me see it.
Yeah, I'm the fact is, the 7th Infantry Division Association has been existing since soon after the end of World War II. And I didn't know about it for about 40 some odd years after I came home from Korea and was discharged. But when I found out about the association, I joined it in 1997 in order to attend a reunion in Knoxville, Tennessee. And they meet every 2 years. They meet on the odd numbered years. And last September, 2013, they met in San Antonio, and they elected me president. So now I'm president of the 7th Infantry Division Association, and will be for 2 years. And if I'm physically able, or still kicking, I'll be maybe president for a couple more years if I can. I'm 84 years old now, so we need some younger people. And the 7th stayed in Korea after the ceasefire for 21 years, longer than any other infantry division. So there's a lot of veterans that serve with the 7th that would be eligible to become members of our association, and we're looking for them.
So, you're stationed in Yeongdeungpo, and then what happened to you? Did you go to 38 Parallel and engage in a combat? Or?
Oh yes.
Tell me about those.
Okay, we even my OCS classmates, some of them were there at the time, were scattered out to the different divisions, all of them. 7 of us went to the 7th Division, and I didn't know this. I didn't find this out until 40 some odd years later, when I was suddenly reunited with some of them, and I started learning this. But I was sent to the 7th Division. I got to the 7th Division headquarters in one day on another train, South Korean train, up in the Chuncheon area, north of there, Triangle Hill area. That's where the 7th was located at that time, and this was probably about, by this time it's October the 24th probably. I was assigned from the 7th Division on down to 7th Division Artillery, and immediately I was assigned to the 57th Field Artillery Battalion.
57?
Yeah, the 57th Field Artillery Battalion. Now they supported the 31st Infantry Regiment. When I got to the 57th Field Artillery Battalion, they immediately assigned me to one of the batteries. And I went to Charlie Battery and theirs. So 7 weeks of that, and I saw some people get killed just right in front of me while I was there. Mostly mortars. But mortars, you don't hear them coming. By the time you hear them coming's too late. Because they're coming from almost straight up. So you got about a fourth of a second warning after you hear a mortar. Artillery shell, you can hear it coming for maybe 10 seconds, 12 seconds. You can tell it's coming. You can tell by the sound it's getting closer. You can tell it's going to hit close to you. So you have time to get into a trench, into a bunker, But anyhow, I was glad to be able to get the transfer back to the air section because it was located 7 miles south of the MLR. And they had the 7th Division had a small dirt airstrip located between this airstrip was almost due north of Seoul, about 50 miles. Right in the vicinity of, 7 miles south of Port Chop Hill. So that's where our division had moved to after I'd been assigned to them. Or They were over in the Triangle Hill area when I first got there. But the day after Christmas is the day we moved. The 7th Division moved to where it stayed up until the ceasefire, in the Old Baldy and T-Bone and Pork Chop Hill there. Okay, I got to the air section, flew my first mission the very next day, on December the 11th. I made a log of all my flights, and I'll give that to you, Mr. Hahn, and it tells exact dates of all these different missions I flew. It was in my 201 files. I couldn't remember that without that. It was just there where I could make a log of it. After we flew 20 missions, which I had the 20th mission by December the 30th, we were awarded the Air Medal. And then you continued to fly missions. A lot of times we flew 2 missions a day, because we flew a 2-hour mission. You know, within 10 minutes we could take off from the dirt airstrip and be up in position to observe and adjust artillery fire along the MLR. Then we'd check out the net by radio and come back to the airstrip. Someone else another L-19 would come up and take our place. And incidentally, we had 2 L-19s in the division in flight, in position at all times, from early morning when you could first see until late in the evening when you couldn't see. And during the summer, you know, your hours are 14 hours long. So in 14 hours, you'd fly, you know, 28 missions by the entire crew, because we had about 10 air observers and 10 pilots. So we had, you know, 2-man teams. So you take off, and I sat in the back seat. The L-19 just seated 2, and it was tandem, you know, 1 pilot observer sitting behind the pilot. And my job was to use binoculars and a map and the radio to call in artillery fire on any target that we thought was worthy of calling artillery fire in on. So the next 40 missions after I got my Air Medal, I got a bronze oak leaf cluster to the Air Medal, and a BOLC, a bronze oak leaf cluster. Essentially, it's just a ditto. It's an award. It's award the same award, the Air Medal. So I flew 40 missions. That would be 60 missions by then. I got my first BOLC. I flew 40 more missions and got my second BOLC. 40 more missions and got the third BOLC. And 40 more missions and got the fourth BOLC. And then I've got it all logged. And then in June, I had started another 40 missions, and I had flown 39 missions, and we kept the missions on a pencil log in the operations building there at the air section. And when we completed the 40th mission, they would be turned into the, you know, the clerk typist, and they were typed up and routed through channels for approval, and then you'd get another award from 8th Army Headquarters of another oak leaf cluster. But what happened I didn't get to fly the 40th mission. I could have flown it, but I had already, my orders were coming up the next day. They told me that I could rotate home. So Captain Carver, our aviation officer, who I'd flown a lot of missions with myself, told me, you're scheduled to fly your last mission today, but he says, you know, we hadn't flown any missions for 2 or 3 days because we'd been just grounded because of, you know, the weather. You know, we were socked in, so to speak. And so the clouds had lifted that day, and we needed to send some people up, if just for reconnaissance, mainly, maybe not just artillery fire. And he said, you don't have to fly this mission, you're leaving to go home tomorrow. So I said, Captain, thank you, sir, I believe I'll decline. So another guy flew my mission that I was scheduled to fly, and guess what? They were shot down. And they were flying real low because it still had a low ceiling. They were flying out over what the MGM River, an area that the MGM River makes a big double loop. And looking at it on a map, it looks like a picture of rabbit ears. And so it was nicknamed Rabbit Ears, just like a lot of the hills were nicknamed, Pork Chop Hill and T-Bone Hill. Well, our plane was shot down in the vicinity of the Rabbit Ears. The pilot bailed out. The observer was unable to get out, and he went down with the plane and was killed. Gilbert Pearsall. I wrote a story about him, and I found his name on a Korean War Veterans Memorial 40 some odd years later in Mobile, Alabama, because he was from Alabama.
So you are lucky to survive.
Yes, sir, because I was scheduled to fly that mission. And my captain said, "You don't have to fly it. You're rotating home tomorrow." So I just thanked him and didn't fly it. And I did leave. Actually wound up leaving 3 days later on October the 10th and October the 7th, yeah, because this man, that our buddy Gilbert Pearsall, was shot down on July the 4th. And I wrote, that's one of the 3 stories I've written about our L-19s that were shot down during the 7 months that I was in the air section.
You didn't regret to be in Korea?
No, sir. Well, at the time I left Korea, of course, I was glad that I was getting to go home.
When did you leave?
I actually left Korea 3 days before the ceasefire. I left on July the 24th, 1953. And if someone had asked me right there when I left Incheon, "Gene, are you ever coming back to Korea?" I would have said, "No, sir." There was nothing, Mr. Hahn, there was hardly anything left in Korea standing back then at that time.
Yeah.
A few buildings in Seoul, but Seoul wasn't much of it wasn't a city then, as we think of a city. It was a big village or town. And all the rest of the towns in Korea were just little villages, but it was mostly agriculture. And the people there, they were like peasants. They had hardly anything. But I'm telling you about the history of Korea. You know it. So I left. I was lucky I got to fly. Most of the people leaving Korea by this time had to get on a troop ship, and it took them 3 weeks to get back home across the broad Pacific. But the day after I got into the replacement depot, someone suggested to me, "Why don't you go into the air transportation office right there?" It was pretty close to where our barracks was. We were waiting on orders to get on the ship. And to see the air traffic, is a warrant officer there, a young warrant officer, and see if you might, by chance, get to go back through Camp Drake, Japan. Once you get there, chances are you're going to fly home. So I went in there. I went in and talked to this young warrant officer. I'm a first lieutenant by this time, and I told him that I had a twin brother stationed in Japan near Tachikawa. It's a little satellite base called Fuchu Base. It's only 10 miles from Camp Drake, Japan. And I hope to be able to process back through Camp Drake, which is where some of my dress uniforms and personal belongings were still stored. If I'd got on the ship, those belongings would have just caught up with me later on somewhere back in the States.
So where did you meet your twin brother?
My twin brother he was sent to Japan about a year before I got orders to go to Korea. And he'd been stationed there in Japan at this Fuchu base, which is a little satellite base of Tachikawa, the big Air Force base. And he was a corporal in a communications, large 5th Air Force, a communications squadron, 315th Combat Cargo. And his job as a communications squadron, they were in charge of delivering communications equipment, radios and everything associated with radios to all the our different Air Force bases in South Korea, which I think my brother Jack says there were 7 or 8 different Air Force bases all over South Korea. The big one was, of course, K-16 at Seoul. Mm-hmm. But on my way to Korea, while I was there in Camp Drake for 4 days, I called Jack, my twin brother. I had found a way to call him there. It wasn't but 10 miles away by phone, and told him I had just gotten there, and he immediately got in his Jeep and drove over, and we got a short visit. So I got to see him. This is the first time to see him in 2 years, and he was in the Air Force. So then, of course, 3 days later, after getting a short visit with him, I got on a troop ship and as I said previously, made my way to Busan and up to the 7th Division. But this warrant officer, I was talking to the warrant officer in Incheon there, waiting on orders to get on a ship or something to come home, and told him about my twin brother being at Tachikawa there, and he looked at me and he says, "Lieutenant, I'm going to put your name on a list I have here." She said, "But I'm not promising you anything." So I walked out of there and I thought, slim chance I'll get to go back through Camp Drake. The next day, I came out on special orders as an air courier to Camp Drake, Japan. So they put me on a C-54, old Army Air Force C-54, and I flew into Japan as an air courier. I had orders, and I had it in a briefcase strapped to handcuffed to my wrist. You know what an air courier is. And I reported into Camp Drake, Japan, and delivered the papers. And then I was there waiting on orders to go back to the States. I got to see my twin brother again. He came over and visited me. And then I think at that point in time, when he saw me, knew I was going home, he'd been in Japan 1.5 years by this time. Mm-hmm. 2 years. 2 years. I think he wasn't married, so he was having a big time in Japan. He probably had 6 or 7 Japanese girlfriends, he was just footloose and fancy free, single, not married. So, but when he saw me going home, I think he started getting homesick for the first time. So, but I didn't get to see him again for a while.
What did you guys say to each other when you meet first, when you were on the way to Busan, and then you met him again on the way back to state? What did you guys talk?
Well, of course, we hugged each other and talked a little bit because we knew we didn't have much time. But he asked me about what had gone on in Korea. Because we wrote to each other regularly.
Have you been back to Korea?
Yes, sir. Went back in '09, just 4 years ago. 4.5 years ago now.
And did you go to the place where you served?
Didn't get to do that. I wanted to go back to where that Able 8 airstrip was located, where I flew most of those missions from. And we got real close to it on a tour bus that took our group up to Panmunjom, because that was part of, I think, most of the vets going down the Korea revisit program get to do that. And if I had stayed, I could have been able to stay a couple, 3 days extra. I think I could have done that, probably. And one of my OCS buddies that was there went on the revisit program before me, 4 or 5 years, went, and I believe it was '04, Jerry Sylvester. And he was actually able to go right to this valley where the airstrip was located. And he told the South Korean guides that were with us that right there is the airstrip, and right across that creek is where our tents were located and everything. And they looked at him kind of funny, like they didn't know whether to believe that or not, because all this stuff is gone. There's no evidence there ever was an airstrip there.
What were you thinking when you were in Korea back in 2009? What was your
Mr. Hahn, it was amazing. It turned out to be a trip. It was a trip of a lifetime for me, because I could not believe what my eyes were seeing. You know, the nation was so modern, more than our side. Seoul was just hundreds of high-rise buildings. It must have looked like maybe there were more 50 or 60, and I find out later that there's people living in them. They're just condominiums. There's what, 20 million people living in Seoul? But the South Korean government and everything we were just treated like royalty. They rolled out the red carpet, and they took us on tours. One of them was Panmunjom, and we actually got to go into the building where the truce talks took place for 2 years, off and on. You're familiar with the history of that. And we were right there where it was actually the dividing line, I think, where the North Koreans and the Chinese were on one side and we sat on the other side. We didn't really know, I guess. We were just so glad to be able to go home. Mm-hmm. But to go back there, 50 some odd years later and meet the people and see what the country had done with their freedom, their democracy. And then it actually gave us closure that we hadn't gotten. Mm. And see how appreciative and see what the South Korean people, several generations, have, and they've taught all their generations what the United States and the other nations that were part of the United Nations, what they did for South Korea, and that South Korean people really appreciate. And so it made us realize that, the sacrifices that we made, even though we were fortunate enough to live and come back home, 34,000 of us didn't, but it just gave us an appreciation that what we did and the sacrifices were not in vain. They were worthwhile.
You made a wonderful point about the legacy of the Korean War veterans, and I think you just brilliantly summarized it.
I never even thought about the word legacy or things like we've been talking about the last few minutes. And of course, until I joined the Korean War Veterans Association quite a few years ago in 2000. So I've been a member of Chapter 215 now for 13 years. Mm. And then we started talking about the legacy, and I've learned a lot about South Korea and the wonderful progress that they've made.
Thank you for your service and fighting for Korean nation. We never forget you. And that's why I created Youth Corps, to continue on your legacy.
Yes.
If your grandchildren is not working on your legacy, nobody will pay attention to it. That's in right. 10 years. So please talk to your grandchildren.
I will, and I hope more Korean War veterans will do the same thing, because the more they know about it, the word spreads.
Thank you so much, sir.
Yes, sir.